Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. We're glad to have you joining us for this webinar on royalty monetization. My name is Kirsten Lloyd, and I'm a partner at Osage University Partners, and I lead up our university relations efforts. Today, I'll be moderating a very distinguished panel. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to have them introduce themselves briefly. Teri, could we start with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Teri Willey, and I've been working at the interface of for-profits and not-for-profits regarding commercialization of university innovations for 40 years now, since the amendment of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1984, allowing exclusive licensing. And I am a past president of Autumn, and my experience with royalty monetization was at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and it involved the transformative treatment for spinal muscular atrophy. And I had the pleasure of, carrying out that duty with the help of Andrew Fineberg. And it was eye-opening and interesting in having the chance to carry out that duty on behalf of my stakeholders. I'm currently the managing director and officer for Pathway to Cures, which is the venture affiliate of the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. And I'm pleased to say that our first investment is a university spinout. Thank you.
Thank you, Teri. So glad, and we're looking forward to hearing more about your experience with royalty monetization. Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan Murr. I'm a partner with the law firm Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. I serve as the co-chair of the firm's life sciences practice. I've been practicing in the life sciences space for over 25 years and have an increasing amount of experience in royalty finance transactions. As I'll talk about in a few minutes here, it's really an asset class that's been growing, where this used to be a bit of a niche a decade plus ago, but really over the past 10 years has exploded in terms of the number of transactions and the number of assets that have been monetized. In my practice, I'm fortunate because I get to represent both buyers and sellers of royalty entitlements. So that includes academic institutions, private biotechs, as well as the large investment funds that purchase these assets. And that really gives me a 360 view of what goes into these transactions, what buyers and sellers are looking for, and where the pitfalls are in these transactions. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Likewise, and we're so glad to have an expert like you on this panel as well. Todd, moving on to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I oversee the tech transfer operation here at Emory University, but I've spent the last 35 years in academic technology transfer, the last 21 years of those here at Emory. Like Teri, I'm an Autumn past president or past chair, whatever we currently call that. I have been involved in a number of different monetizations. One in 2005 that was a very structured, robust process where we monetized our future royalties in an HIV drug called emtricitabine for a one-time payment of $540 million. And then several smaller ones where we've just worked with the licensee outside the constraints of the license agreement to monetize our future royalties. And I look forward to talking more.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. And we will move on to Andrew. So glad to have you here today as well.
Thank you, Kirsten. Appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for allowing me to participate with you all. I have been monetizing royalties on behalf of clients as an advisor since 2008. I have monetized royalties for both corporate entities, but mostly, let's say 95% of what I have done over that time has been for universities. It's a wonderful space to be in. I love doing my job. I had a brief stint on the buy side, and now I am back to advising universities and other clients on royalty monetization, and looking forward to talking about the topic here.
Great. So as you can see, you could not ask for a better panel to talk about this particular subject. We've got experts from all sides of the table here. I will say that I just wanted to put a shout out to Teri, because she really organized putting all these wonderful panelists together. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. We'll move on to the next slide. Do want to do a short intro on OUP for those of you who don't know us. We're a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising participation rights available through their licenses. As a part of this partnership, the institutions share in our profits, and they receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups, things like this particular webinar today. OUP is now on its fourth fund and has made investments in over 140 companies in all areas of deep science. Many of those companies have had successful exits. And if we go to the next slide, we can just show some of the portfolio companies and the areas that those are in. We're always happy to talk about our model. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. And at the end of this presentation, we will put up a slide that will show all of our contact information for those of you who would like to contact us. So we'll go to the next slide. A recording of this webinar is going to be available on OUP's partner portal, and a recording will also be publicly available via our YouTube channel. The partner portal is an online portal for the tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner universities, and is full of relevant tech transfer and startup content. Once you're in the portal, which you do need to register for if you don't already have an account, you'll find a link for this webinar on our webinars page, which is under the startup resources section. We do encourage questions throughout this webinar. I see someone already put something in our Q&A box. I haven't looked at it yet, but use the Q&A tool. That's the easiest way for me as the moderator to keep track of the questions that are asked and be able to ask those questions of our panelists. So I do want to note also that we have some upcoming webinars that may be of interest to our audience. We have one on September 24th, which is the second part of our Finding Your Startup CEO series. This one is on sourcing the CEO and other hires for your academic startup. Then on October 8th, we have our Ask a VC. This is our yearly Ask a VC webinar where we answer your questions. We have two of our managing partners on this, and any questions you have about startups, VC, what's going on in the investment world, et cetera, you can ask on this webinar. On October 15th, we're very excited to have an industry-focused webinar on AI, which will feature venture capital investors who are looking at the AI space. And then on November 14th, we are going to have a whole webinar focused on venture studios that my colleague Jamie Testai will be putting on. So if you have any questions about those, let us know. But we are really here to talk about our subject, which is university royalty monetization. So with that, we will take down this slide deck. And we're going to ask our first question. And the first question that I have actually is to talk about what is royalty monetization. I think that from some of the questions that we had initially about this webinar from the attendees is really defining what is a royalty monetization. And Andrew, I'm going to pass this off to you. I know you have a slide that you'd like to share as well that will help with the explanation of what a royalty monetization is.
Thank you, Kirsten. Appreciate that. Let me just share that screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. I think it's great that this is where we're starting. When we do talk about a royalty monetization, I want to take one step back and talk about basically the essence of a royalty. I'm sure everybody on this call knows what a royalty is. To be clear, we're talking about passive royalties, not synthetic royalties. A synthetic royalty is a financial instrument that's used by corporate entities when they're marketing their own product. Here we are focused on passive royalties, which pay a set of future cash flows, and they're typically owed as a part of a license of a technology. It's usually partial consideration to use that technology. The licensor will get paid if the licensee that is using that IP successfully brings a product to market that uses that IP and obviously starts generating sales. And then a prediction of those future sales is really going to be the main driver of a royalty asset's value. There are a couple of other elements, including discount rates and other things, because this is a cash flow analysis at the end of the day. But the predictions for how the product itself will perform, and the product will perform based on how the marketer successfully sells that product, that is what, at the end of the day, is going to generate the greatest element associated with the value of that royalty. So whether you hold it or whether you sell it, a royalty is therefore a very speculative asset. And with every speculative asset, it will attract investors that are willing to take the risk of loss to own those cash flows. So when one talks about monetizing a royalty asset, you are selling all or a portion of the future cash flows for an upfront payment. This isn't debt. You aren't going to owe interest. You aren't going to be forced to pay it back. It's somewhat caveat emptor. It is going to be non-recourse to the seller. And you can protect yourself by employing the right structure and running the right process, which we'll discuss later on. My colleagues will certainly, on this, my fellow panelists will certainly cover much of this. And so how and what is monetized and with whom you transact is what we are all here to talk about. And I wanted to put at the bottom of the slide sort of a little quote, if you will, to really embody what monetizing a royalty is. I own a financial asset called a royalty interest. I acquired it by licensing my technology to another party. I am selling you a portion of those royalties, but I still own the IP. And I don't owe you anything if the product does not perform to expectations.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think that really shows the risk that's behind this, right? This is a financial asset, and people are taking calculated risks based on that financial asset itself. Ryan, I remember first hearing about royalty monetization, I think around 2000 or so, 2001. I was at a university and we had a royalty stream that we were getting some offers for. And back then it was kind of hard to figure out, like, how do we do this? And what do we do even for advice on whether we should look at, monetizing this royalty stream? Could you talk a little bit about how this market has changed over time and where it is now versus perhaps 20 to 30 years ago?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, your initial experience is about the same as mine. My first monetization was in 2002. And at the time, it was really a niche product. There were relatively few investors in the space. That meant at the time that when you went to market with a royalty, there was not a lot of price exploration. And when you received multiple bids, there were often pretty big spreads between how people were valuing these assets. What's really happened since is there's been a real inflow of capital into this asset class. As insurance companies and pension funds and other institutional investors are looking for returns that are uncorrelated with the market performance, where they can get steady streams of cash flow, sort of irrespective of what's happening in the stock market, this asset class has really ballooned. And as I said in my sort of opening comments, over the past decade, we've seen a massive increase in the number of players in the space on the buy side. And what's that's meant is more competitive processes, better price exploration, tighter bids in terms of how people are valuing the assets, and also a willingness for a lot of parties to look at buying assets that are in the earlier stages of development where they're taking potentially some development risk. Although I will say, by and large, there's still a strong preference. Most of the buyers are really looking at commercial or near commercial assets. There's a market survey that we do internally, and I just have some data that is interesting for the 4-year period ended last year, so ending 2023. There was a 25% increase in the annual deal volume of royalty monetizations over that period, and a 30% increase in the deal size on an annual basis. And that's particularly noteworthy as that was a time when you had interest rates rising. You had Andrew commenting about the impact of discount rates, and so higher interest rates do tend to make it a bit less favorable. And even in a rising rate environment, you're still seeing a significant increase, each year in terms of the total volume of deals. The upfront the average upfront purchase price was $215 million. And that's a misleading average in a way, which is the companies that are reporting this data tend to be the small and mid-cap public companies that are the sellers. And so there's imperfect visibility into, what the sort of the true averages are, or what a university average might be. The academic royalties tend to have lower royalty rates. And so if you look at sort of what an average upfront would be for a university relative to a strategic or a corporate seller, they're going to be different just based on the overall economics of the license. But that represents a significant increase over what it was just 4 years before. So we are seeing a very crowded market. That's a great thing for sellers. It does make it more competitive for buyers. But it is a great time to be in the space if you have assets that you're thinking about monetizing. And just going back to Andrew's slide on why one might consider monetizing a royalty, and I know we'll talk more about this later. My experience with academic institutions in particular is they will have a successful drug and it will be a disproportionate amount of their overall exposure to future cash flows. And it's, sort of put differently, you have all your eggs in one basket. And the ability to be able to transfer the risk associated with the future performance to a buyer who has a portfolio of these, who can bear the risk of one failure without it really having a tremendous impact on the overall performance of the fund, is just a smart way to shift the risk and to be able to maximize the upfront and move that risk over to a party who has a diversified portfolio who could bear that risk. So that's really the key driver here.
Kirsten, I just wanted to add that in addition to Ryan's comment about there's more money in this asset class, it also feels to me like there's more assets in this asset class.
Mm-hmm.
That's fair.
I mean, as universities, tech transfer programs have matured and grown and blossomed, we've had time now for more big hit technologies to hit within our portfolios and to mature to the point in time where they might actually have this kind of value.
Absolutely. Andrew, did you have something that you wanted to add on that?
No, sorry, I was moving around, but I was
All
just moving stuff around in the office.
No worries. So next question then, Todd, you've done this a couple of times. When you maybe you can talk about your experience about when it made sense to monetize a royalty stream, but maybe more generally talk about when could it make sense to monetize a royalty stream by an academic institution?
Yeah, well, I guess the simplest answer is it could make sense at any time. The other thing that I think what was important for me to recognize, and I guess I would urge my colleagues to sort of view this the same way, it's not my decision as to whether or not the institution wants to monetize an asset, particularly a large asset. I might run the tech transfer office and I might be responsible for doing our deals, but at the end of the day, it is very clear to me that if Emory is sitting on a gold mine, so to speak, or a windfall and wants to consider monetizing, that's not my decision. And so I did the thing back in 2003, 2004 that I needed to do, and that was to share the interest in monetizing a royalty with our leadership so that they can that they can get involved. What was the other component of that question, Kirsten?
I think that was mainly it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there because I know we want to build a story here. Yeah.
Well, and there's an interesting question there. I mean, one is sort of what's the earliest point at which you can, and there are a few buyers in the space who will buy a royalty on an asset that's in phase 2 or phase 3, and they'll take the development risk. Most of the buyers in the space are going to wait until you have an approved product, and then Andrew, I'd love your thoughts on this. I mean, do you sell early in the launch? Do you wait to see the slope of the launch curve? I mean, sort of how do you minimize risk yet maximize the ultimate return and the opportunity there? And how do you think about that?
It's actually a great segue, Ryan, to a couple of points that I did want to raise. Thank you for that. I agree that there are opportunistic buyers that will take a look at a royalty before it's approved. Generally speaking, though, if you're talking about a passive royalty, there is a considerable amount of clinical diligence that has to go into buying a pre-approved asset. And more often than not, the university is not going to have access to that information of the developer. Usually that's going to come right from the developer. And of course, there'll be situations where an investor will have a close relationship with the developer, the actual developer of a product, and be able to use that to do the diligence that is required. But generally speaking, I would say that there is a market for post-approved assets, and there are opportunistic ways of selling a pre-approved asset. But of course, that's going to be at a significant discount, because at the end of the day, that's really a venture bet on the behalf of an investor, of a buyer.
But
also, I'm sorry, did someone have a comment?
Sorry, I was just going to say, but to be clear, we're being approached at universities by buyers at all stages. I'm not, you're right. I mean, absolutely. And I guess my point was, you need to have something that somebody wants to buy. So at any time you think you've got something that somebody might want to buy, you don't need for a royalty buyout firm or the licensee to approach you. You as a university can decide to approach them. But also at universities, we've been approached by opportunities to collectively combine several smaller royalty positions or pre-buy things. I don't know how many of those transactions have happened, probably not many. But we get, I don't know if bombarded is the right word, but we get approached by potential buyers at sort of all levels, including pre-buying access to rights.
Yeah, it's a great point, Todd. And I didn't want to minimize the opportunity. What I did want to stress, though, is that if you're going to run a competitive process and you're going to invite many players, you're going to proactively run a process, and you want to collect bids from multiple players, the best thing to do is to wait until the drug is approved to do that, just given how much easier it is for the market to do the diligence that they need to do and to put forth bids that are going to be similar to one another, if you will, in value. And that's going to be obviously very hinged on the discount rate, which is going to be further related to the risk of the asset that they're buying. I know we want to move on to the next question, but just quickly to finish a point. Once the drug is approved, there is an interesting question about when the right time is to monetize a royalty. And I think that because the space is so much more competitive than it was before, investors are willing to take the ramp risk. So they're willing to buy early. There's normally a significant amount of optimism at the beginning of a sales curve. Once a drug is approved, to either hit a condition that has not been otherwise addressed by other drugs, or do it better. There's sizzle on the steak, and you want to sell into that sizzle. So I think selling a drug early makes a lot of sense. But of course, a buyer will want to see that trajectory, as Ryan mentioned.
And maybe just adding to that, I think more often if there's a surprise on the launch, it tends to be on the downside, not the upside. And if you feel like there's significant future opportunity with the drug because of a follow-on indication or an expansion of the label or something else, you can deal with that in terms of the structure of the sale. And we'll talk about that later. Andrew's got a couple of slides on that as well, where if you feel like you're selling too early and you're not capturing the upside, there are ways to mitigate against that risk.
I feel like Ryan and I are an old married couple finishing each other's sentences. Awesome.
Indeed.
You've been doing it together too long, yeah. So Teri, I'm going to move on to you. I'm going to move on to the decision path on royalty monetization. And just your advice on the decision to monetize or not, how to approach that. This is decision path once it's agreed to move forward with the monetization and how that happens. And then talk about the stakeholders involved in that decision process. So could you kind of run through that for us for a monetization?
Sure. I mean, as you're all hearing, one of the first steps is really to understand what your options are. And my advice there with the decision path is to start early in socializing the idea. As Todd said, it may not be the head of tech transfer that's making that decision, but it is a decision that involves the president of the organization, the chief financial officer, legal counsel, and certainly legal counsel and the tech transfer will be the ones that are carrying out the work. And so it's really important to understand how it falls together. So first advice is socialize the idea early, start to meet with the stakeholders inside the university and make sure that everybody's coming along and learning about what is it about. And most importantly, why? Ask why. Why do we want to do this? Why do we want to consider this? And, you know, one of the things that I experienced was it was really important to make sure that there was a thoughtful decision process because the results of a monetization could be material to your organization. And in the example that I mentioned earlier, the monetization would allow the organization I worked with to move up a really important research program by 5 years if they were successful in monetizing. So that was their why, is if we were able to do this and do it in a way where we mitigated risks and could carry out a crisp process, then we could really have a positive impact on our mission in science. And so for the decision path, it's very important. Identify the stakeholders, identify who will have to make decisions within your organization. How high does that level have to go authority-wise? Does there need to be a subcommittee of your board of directors or your trustees involved? How would you go about setting that up? And one of the things that helped us was working with an advisor to outline that process who had been through it before, and then to just project manage it holistically, make sure you're meeting regularly, make sure you're addressing questions, and you know, so forth. It's because once you pull the trigger, especially if you're entertaining offers from multiple sellers, you're going to have to move quickly. And you want to make sure that you can do that. But I'd also like to hear from Todd on this question too, because he's been through it more times than I have, and in a larger organization as well.
Yeah, well, you know, I remember when we started down that path, I thought I have no idea what the process is and who the stakeholders are. And I can tell you sitting here, what has it been now? It's almost 20 years later. I don't know what the process would be if we had to do it again. And the reason I say that is because as your leadership changes, how it gets handled will change. And so because that affects the stakeholders, what school, what dean is involved. It may also impact the level of comfort that certain senior leadership may have in this. Our decision ultimately went to the Board of Trustees the first time around on the big one. And if we were to do a big one again, I suspect it would go to the Board of Trustees. What pathway it would take and what role the various cast of characters would play would have to be seen. But I would say that it's a major challenge in trying to really assess whether or not your institution's got a real interest in monetizing something, is because there's really no way to test that process and that system. At least for me, there wasn't, Teri. I don't know, maybe there would be for you. There's no way to really take a straw poll on that, so to speak, without it sort of being real. Because the facts will matter with regards to who the stakeholders are.
Yeah, and we started by doing frankly, some lunch and learns with key stakeholders to say we may have an opportunity to monetize. It looks like this drug could be approved. Let's walk through why we might want to do that or not want to do that, and you know, who would be involved. And so we started mapping it out early, almost a year in advance. And even with the year in advance, we ended up with an early approval. And had to scramble at the end for some of the things that needed to be in place, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's going to be different in each institution. So starting early, taking, one of the groups that calls you up to say they're interested in, say, would you come and do a lunch and learn with the folks in my office? Put them to work and doing a Q&A with you and learn as much as you can.
So
Yeah,
Todd,
from
we have a question from
experience.
sorry, go ahead, Andrew. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say,
Right.
from experience with some large university systems, I can think of 5 stakeholders that you have to sort of think about. It's the local campus, it's the tech transfer office. You've got the relevant schools. I mean, Todd, you mentioned that the dean of the medical school or whatever it is. You have the main university system and the internal legal compliance department. And then you have the inventors who may have an entitlement to a portion of the royalty, and trying to get alignment across at least the first 4, if not all 5, takes time and takes some real effort. And sort of the funny distillation of that was in one of these transactions, the buyer was asking for a completely normal and unremarkable legal opinion that said that the agreement received the necessary authorizations and was signed by the right people when we handed it over and asked for a very large check. And we didn't know how we were going to give that opinion because there was no sort of formal distillation of who approves this or what the process is. And we ended up getting that opinion from campus council. But it sort of put a fine point on it, which is, this is an amorphous process that may not have precedent in many institutions, and in many cases, you're making it up as you go along if it's the first time.
It's really exciting, and it's and involving the inventors is really interesting and can be very fun as well. And they turn out to be so important in the process once you decide to move forward, and just the due diligence that goes on to understand the ballpark figure and the analysis that's done to determine what could happen next with this treatment, what else is going on in the field that could take its place. And the other thing is not only the inventors that you know about, but once word gets out that this could be a success, people will come out of the woodwork believing or representing that they had something to do with it as well. And we can talk more about that as we think about what would you have to
Right.
do before you proceed.
We've actually had a lot of questions from the audience regarding the inventors' involvement in the process and et cetera. So actually, why don't we just go to that topic right now? So what is your involving the inventors' perspectives, engagement in the process? What's the process you follow when an inventor wants to monetize their share of future royalties? Todd, I'm going to pass this to you. Or in the counter to that, let's say the university is interested in monetization, but the inventors are not. Can you talk a little bit about how that could work?
Yeah, so we ended up with a transaction of 540 million, and 40% of that went to 3 individuals, inventors. So it was a substantial amount of money that went to our inventors per our IP policy. So managing their expectations in this process, I would say, was critical for us from day one. I also think that it's important. I will also tell you that it was incredibly difficult. It was on again, off again with regards to whether or not our inventors were going to sell and whether the institution was going to sell. And sometimes it felt like we were ships passing in the night. At the end of the day, though, everybody did sell. We view that as being important to our overall transaction and our opportunity to sort of deliver the best price and to make sure that everybody felt like they were treated fairly out of this. But so I would say at a minimum, it's important to be communicating with your inventors. But we all know that inventors can be very unpredictable, and they can be very independent entities. They can be very difficult to control. They may or may not they may or may not be under your current employ. All of those things are going to factor in as there may be 1 or there may be 10. All of those things factor in and become one more variable that you have to try to control and address as you rally the chuck wagons with all the stakeholders in it to figure out whether or not you can get an aligned perspective on it.
And could someone, Andrew, maybe you want to talk to, my understanding is too that it can actually work that only part of the royalty then is monetized. Perhaps you could monetize the share that goes to the university, but the inventors don't do their share. Or the inventors themselves could potentially, it depends on the institution and how this works, could monetize their share. So I think this could be very institution specific. But Andrew, maybe you could talk about the different flavors that you've seen.
Sure, happy to do that. And I definitely want to go back to the question of partially selling a royalty when we start talking about structure with Ryan, but this is slightly different. We have seen a number of ways that the idea of a royalty monetization even starts. I probably one of the first institutional royalties that I sold, the process started with the inventor. And the university made the decision that they wanted to handle the process, and then the inventor ultimately got what they were looking to do done. But it was, the whole conversation started with the inventor in that situation. Actually, I can think of two situations when that happened. I'm going to say something fairly controversial, but not meant to start any rifts at all. At the end of the day, the IP, if it's invented in a lab at a university campus, it's owned by the university. So if the university wanted to affect a monetization, the inventor would have to come along if the university said that they had to come along. Now, that's somewhat theoretical because, as we all know, institutions want to keep their inventors happy, and I think it makes complete sense to keep them happy. And very often there isn't any conflict in that regard. But there are certainly questions. There are different motives, excuse me, that an inventor will have versus what a university may want to do. If an inventor wants to separately monetize their stake, they will still need the help of the university in some regard as well. There will need to be some support by the university to help them do that, whether they're still on campus or not. And generally speaking, and Todd and Teri, please comment on this, there's usually an IP policy in place. It's usually pre-wired in terms of what the inventor and what the lab that the inventor is working in is going to get. And there's a stack. And that somewhat, makes the conversation, a little bit easier, at least in my experience. That's what I've seen.
Yeah.
But I think the key takeaway is it can go any which way, right? You can do it with the inventors, without the inventors. You can include them in the process. You can leave them alone to keep collecting their entitlement. Andrew's last point of the inventors realistically can't really monetize, certainly in terms of maximizing the value, because there's just they need the university to assist in the process and provide information in the process. So that's the one piece where it's most difficult. It's possible, but it's most difficult for the inventors to sell their entitlement without the university participating. But sometimes the inventors, if it's a meaningful royalty, will be the catalyst for causing the university to go out and to do price exploration and decide whether they're going to be a seller. But there is a lot of flexibility here from the buyer's perspective in terms of, how much they'll take. Usually the answer is, we'll take as much as you're willing to sell if we like the asset and we believe it. And if that's just the university selling its piece, that's fine. If that's the inventors selling a portion, that's fine. If it's everybody selling everything, that's fine too.
Yeah, and I think too, my philosophy has been to err on the side of just keeping the inventors involved all through the process. It's more difficult if they're no longer at your institution, but you can still reach out to them. Sometimes they may even be in another country by the time that something reaches the market, or you may be dealing with their estate. But as much as you can, keep them involved in the process step by step. It'll go smoother. Their input will be meaningful as the analysis is done about what will happen in the future with this product. And so, you know, be their business agent and rope them in.
Great. Andrew, do we want to go back to the other question now?
You mean related to the different structures?
Yes.
Sure, we can do that, Kirsten. And actually, this was something I think that Ryan, did you want to start the conversation there about how to partially monetize a royalty, and then I'll chime in with structures?
Sure, and we sort of touched on this, I guess, a couple of different times. So this is a good segue to let Andrew put up his slides here. So the question is, you know, can you monetize only a portion of it, and sort of what are different transaction structures? And the answer is yes. I mean, this is a space where transactions can be very flexible and very creative. There are a couple of sort of main structures that you see most often, but you can sell all of a royalty, you can sell a portion of the royalty. As Andrew will explain, you can sell it up to a certain cap, or it's uncapped. And the different structures are really solving for the perspectives as the buyers and sellers in terms of risk and reward, and the ultimate, you know, view on valuation and the opportunity for the long-term performance of the drug. It also can be, these structures can be something that would be used to solve for future events in terms of questions like overall patent term and potential patent term extension, follow-on indications, and maybe a broadening of the label. So depending on how people are thinking about what the long-term performance of the drug might be, you might consider different versions of this. So with that, Andrew, I'll hand it over to you to let you put your slides up.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. That was a good introduction to this topic. So as Ryan mentioned, there are actually a variety of structures that one can employ, and you can mix and match them. It's actually it's a palette, if you will, that you can paint with. When you ultimately decide to monetize, you're usually doing it with a certain goal in mind, and those goals are some combination of risk and return. But again, it always goes back to the predictions of how the drug itself is going to perform. You know, one of the things that I think we'll get to is, before you actually start the process, or you go to market with a royalty, there's some preparation that you're going to want to do. And one of those things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get an appraisal done. That's what we always recommend, is to get an appraisal done by an outside party that is an arm's length, that doesn't have any ulterior motives that an investment bank might, which is why public equity research isn't always the best tool to provide these inputs. But you're going to want a really good set of projections of how the IP embodying product is going to perform, because at the end of the day, as we mentioned, that's going to be the biggest impact to the value of the royalty that you're selling. All that being said, once you have an idea of the way that you, the market, various others think that the drug is going to perform, you can then think about what is the right structure for what I'm trying to accomplish. So then, going back to risk and reward, the first type of structure that one would think about is just a strip. Very simple. It's the simplest structure to document when you're selling it. And it's effectively saying, I'm selling 10, 20, 30, 100% of the royalty that I am entitled to, you know, as a result of whatever contract I signed. We always recommend that a seller never sell the entire entitlement, because you never know, right? It's great insurance to hold a little back in case the drug ends up outperforming. And if it doesn't end up outperforming, well, you've got a great bolus of capital that you now have in your control that you can work with yourself. But talking about that strip, that's going to be the easiest one. If I'm selling 10%, buyer, you get 10, I keep 90, and so it goes to the end of the royalty paying period. And then you can go back to the well if you wanted to. You can sell more, over time, you basically can cut off little pieces of the royalty along the way, should that satisfy whatever strategic goal you had in doing so. The second type of royalty monetization that one could consider is a capped royalty. Now, when you're a 501c3, you have to be super careful, because if it's a fully capped deal, that could attract unrelated business income tax, and that's the last thing you want. Obviously, you're acting in a safe harbor where you don't have to worry about tax, and you certainly wouldn't want to have a monetization all of a sudden attract the ire of the IRS, and all of a sudden you're paying taxes when you weren't previously. But that said, just to further the point about structures, there is a way to sell a capped royalty. I should also mention that everything that I just said about a capped royalty, that's really more of a US phenomenon. Outside the US, you have a little bit more leeway to affect that type of transaction. So right now, just on this page, we're talking about a strip, or we're talking about a capped sale. Oops. The hybrid, which is really the structure that I think has worked best for the clients that I have worked with in the academic realm, it has been the cap and tail. And the cap and tail is exactly as it sounds. You're selling up to a certain cap, after which the royalty is shared on some basis. And that tail, there are strategic reasons to make the tail thin, to make the tail thicker. Again, it's going to be based on the risk that you're trying to mitigate by selling it to somebody else, the value or the upfront proceeds that you're trying to get. Obviously, a thicker tail will get you, selling a thicker tail will get you more proceeds than selling a thinner one. There are lots of ways that one could employ the cap and tail, and I always like to say that when you're doing a cap and tail, you're basically getting your cake and being able to eat it too, just because of the way that the royalty will fit into that particular instrument.
And one thing I would sorry, Andrew, just to comment here, on the cap, you had the UBIT concern for the 501c3s. On the cap and tail, depending on the substance of the tail, how thick or not it is it, how much real risk and opportunity is the buyer getting, beyond hitting the cap there, you may or may not still have the UBIT considerations. So it may be a way to solve for it, but it's not binary. The substance of the tail does matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a terrific point, Ryan. And there is, I do think, a formula where one could protect oneself in terms of the thickness of that tail. But again, it is going to be situationally specific for sure.
Right.
And then that's actually a great segue to the last type of royalty structure that one can employ, and it's the annual cap. And typically, when I've seen an annual cap employed, it's usually a graduated cap. It's not necessarily a fully capped transaction. The essence of that structure is you set a threshold as a part of the contract. The buyer gets the royalties up to that threshold, after which the royalty goes back to the seller, and so it goes until December 31st, and the counter resets. There are some limitations to that could also attract UBIT, so you have to be very careful how you structure that. But also, the way that I've seen it done most effectively is, instead of it going from whatever the royalty is that you're selling to zero, it will graduate down to zero, and that will also, I think, be very helpful to the UBIT analysis.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the explanation of these possible different structures that could be employed for royalty monetization. We only have about 10 minutes left in our scheduled time. We're going to probably go over the extra 15 minutes because we have so many questions from the audience. So just to let you know, audience, we are going to try to answer all of your questions. But I do want to now move on, Ryan, to talk about the royalty purchase agreement itself. Could you explain that a bit? especially considering the different models we just heard? And also, are there clauses that could be in the license agreements the universities have that could help smooth the process in the event of a monetization?
Sure. The royalty purchase agreement itself is relatively straightforward from the seller's perspective. They are selling whatever the portion of the future entitlement is, back to Andrew's slides from just a minute ago, and it will specify sort of the mechanics for that. There was a question in the chat about sort of what happens with the cash flows. Usually, if you're selling all of it, it's just going to be redirected directly to the buyer. If you're selling a portion of it and you're splitting it up, it would normally go into an escrow. And then the quarterly royalty payments would then be divided up and distributed out of the escrow to the parties in accordance with the split. So the purchase documentation is pretty straightforward. It's sort of getting up to that point that's the complicated piece in terms of running the process and getting valuations and getting alignment on what the terms are and the economics and which of these variations on the screen. The piece that you asked, Kirsten, about the license agreement and sort of the licensee is an interesting one, because you do have really sort of a three-way relationship that you're setting up here between the licensor, the licensee, and then the purchaser of the royalty. And that is going to be a long-term three-way relationship that's going to be in place for a decade or more. And as a threshold matter, there are some things that you need to think about in the license agreement in order to make the sale of the royalty really possible, or at least not painful. As a threshold matter, the license agreement often has a provision at the back that says the parties to this contract shall not assign any of the rights or obligations without the consent of the other party. So there's language that would typically say, if a university or an inventor wanted to sell the future cash flows under the agreement to a purchaser of a royalty interest, the usual language is you have to go to the licensee and get their consent. Sometimes you see carve-outs for that, but that's sort of the baseline of what we often see as the starting point. The thing that you need to be mindful of is you're not just selling the right to receive the future royalty payments. Ideally, you're also allowing the transfer of confidential information under the license agreement. And specifically, that would be things like the royalty reports, maybe correspondence between the licensor and the licensee about what's happening with IP or the FDA or development plans or commercialization plans. And the buyer of the royalty really has every interest and every right to receive that information for the benefit of monitoring and tracking the investment that they're making in this. So one of the things that the university or the licensor is going to need to do is to go to the licensee and say, we'd like to get your consent. We'd like to get your consent to not only transfer the royalties, the entitlement of the cash flow. We also would like your consent to be able to share certain information to the buyer. And in most instances, that's not really problematic because the buyers of these entitlements are institutional funds, and there's not sort of the usual sensitivity of competitors seeing the information and concerns about the information being used for some nefarious purpose. But that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes there is sensitivity, sometimes relationships are strained, sometimes licensees may just have a no response, for all of these approaches. And so each of these needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And this ought to be one of the first things that you go through at the start of the process, which is take inventory of what the license agreement says, figure out what consents, what you can and can't do. Sometimes there is language that allows you to share information or royalty reports with a third party providing financing or something like that. One of your questions, Kirsten, was, what would you want to do on the front end in writing the license agreements? In a perfect world, you would have a carve out in the anti-assignment provision that you can assign in connection with the financing or a sale of the royalty interests. And for sharing confidential information, it would allow sharing information with third parties who are providing financing or something like that. The other thing to keep in mind is it's very possible that the licensee might be an interested buyer of the royalty themselves. And so there's a question that often comes up strategically of when do you approach the licensee for the consent, recognizing that they may also want to throw their hat in the ring to buy or to bid on the asset. And so is that something that you do early in the process and tip them off that you have this process, in which case it may sort of, get sidetracked? Do you save it for the end? But if you save it for the end, you want to make sure that you're going to end up at a place where the buyers are happy with the form of consent that's coming back. And then finally, I just want to touch on something that Todd had mentioned when we were having the planning session for the presentation today, and that is, it sounds like, Todd, at least your office is seeing this increasing request by licensees of a buyout right, where the licensee has an ability to buy out their own future royalty obligation, either on a fixed sum or pursuant to some formula or something else like that. That's not really a royalty monetization in the sense that we're talking about today. That's just a call option by the licensee. And I would think that in every instance, that's disadvantageous to the university, because the licensee is going to exercise the call option only when it's in the money, meaning you're not getting full value for it. But Todd, I'll let you comment on what you're seeing and kind of how you're responding to it.
And Todd, I'd love for you to, as you answer that, also to provide your advice on the approach to the licensee on these types of transactions as well.
Yeah, well, I was going to comment, Ryan, our banker that we used and for our monetization gave us all a commemorative binder with the various contracts related to our monetization. And it's, I kid you not, it's a good 6 inches thick. Now, in our case, we didn't sell the entire patent estate, so to speak. We just sold one molecule, and there were other molecules that were affected by the patent rights. And so there are some trailing obligations the institution can have, particularly when things start getting litigated to produce documents and various things like that. So it's not like you're necessarily 110% done with it, even though the money might have been spent years ago. So with regards to what we're seeing, and in the spirit of full transparency, I've seen most of this pressure to introduce some sort of royalty cash out provisions, really mostly in our medical device license agreements. But I suspect that others would like to see them as well. And to be honest with you, I think they would take sort of whatever they could get. On the one that I pushed back on and was concerned I might blow up a $20 million syndicate, at the end of the day, the investor was willing to live with language that said that we would be willing to sit down and have a conversation around a royalty cash out, which I said we'd be willing to do whether the language is in there or not, but we put it in there for optical purposes. And so I could have since I got away with that, I could have theoretically agreed, if you would have peeled that or put the layers back on the onion, I could have agreed to something that was much more prescriptive and anywhere in between, and probably have done a better job of satisfying the investor. What was the follow-up question around that, Kirsten?
It was just any other advice with regards to working with the licensee on these types of transactions?
Yeah, in our case, our purchase was made between the licensee and Royalty Pharma. It was split 65-25. So the licensee was very involved in that. The other two smaller ones that I've done have been with the licensee. I think we had, if I recall correctly, close to 20 bidders. And one of the concerns was whether or not there was going to be enough cash on hand to actually fund the proceeds. I don't know how often that occurs these days, but in some of these big ones, that could be a concern too. And so one of the things that we took into consideration was whether or not we were going to be able to get the proceeds on the timeline that we wanted. That was part of the analysis that we had that we made in our final decision to pick the buyer that we picked. So yeah, I think the licensee obviously is somebody to think of, particularly if you're going to go out and entertain a bidding process. If the licensee is not already in the thick of that, why not make sure they are?
Yeah.
One thing
because they by definition are a party that probably is already up to speed more than any of the rest of us with regards to what the potential is and what the risks are.
But to
Agreed.
that end, Todd, I think that they would try to leverage that probably against you, claiming that they have perfect information about their product and try to put you over a barrel. We have found certainly that it is a very rare circumstance that the licensee ends up being the best bidder or be the one that offers the highest valuation in a process.
Yeah.
There was a recent transaction that I did where actually the licensee was the best bidder, but that was completely to my surprise, just given what I'd seen in the past. More often than not, I find that the licensee, will put that out there. Will say that they have that perfect information, but they won't be able to have the same cost of capital as a financial buyer, and there will be other reasons why they may be limited where a financial buyer will not.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Absolutely. And I would certainly never advocate for going and doing a deal just exclusively with the licensee if the value is very substantial. The other thing I would add, though, is that there's a lot to go into this analysis of what the commercial success is and what the what am I trying to say? The rate, the risk rate, the risk factor would be in these decisions. And so the more information you can gather, it can be very helpful. So I would advocate that even if you don't think they're going to be the buyer, it could be interesting to know at least what the doomsday party is going to say the doomsday is. One of the challenges for us in our monetization was at the time we did it, nobody ever contemplated that HIV drugs would be used to prevent HIV transmission. It just wasn't sort of on the table back then. So all I'm getting at is it can get really complicated with regards to sort of really truly analyzing what royalties you might expect to see and what the risk factor ought to be. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of guesswork that goes into it. So the more perspectives you can hear to a large extent, the more informed decision I guess you can make in the process.
I'm going to ask my next question of Teri. Is there anything, what else needs to be in place for these types of transactions? Government reporting, engagement of third-party funders as it relates to the research, patented research results, due diligence on the patent portfolio, et cetera. Is there anything in particular that you can just advise our audience on what needs to be put in place?
Yeah, and these are things you should have in place already, especially if you have an asset that's entering clinical trials or as far along as phase 2 clinical trials. But what's very important is to make sure you have done an appropriate analysis of the funding that has gone into the science that created the results that are used to support the claims in your patent application. That's that supports the product that's reaching market or that has reached the market. And that you understand your obligations to each of those funding sources. And so those of you in tech transfer know that can be funding that goes back a ways and can be multiple sources. It can be federal funding. It can be disease-specific foundation funding. And it can certainly be industry funding. So making sure you understand the obligations, whether there are revenue sharing obligations with those funders, and that for your government reporting, that your government reporting is up to date. If federal funds were used in the research resulting in data that was used to support claims in a patent, that you reference that federal funding in your abstract of the patent. You just want to make sure that everything is in order and that you also are aware of the individuals who worked on each of those projects, that you revisit your patent analysis where inventorship was being determined and make sure that you're comfortable with it. And that you have looked at your patent applications and issued patents from all the directions you should when you are doing exclusive licenses. But make sure that is all in order, because you may find other stakeholders in the process. And if you want to bring them along with you on this monetization, it's really important to have those things lined up. And as those of you that work in tech transfer know, that a disease-specific foundation agreement providing research may have some terms about sharing, but those terms may not be definitive. They may be hard to interpret. And so there may be some amendments to agreements that need to go on. be put in place, just so everything is lined up. So you can all go forward with the monetization together, and there's nothing nicer than sharing returns with your institution and your funders, as well as your inventors.
Yes. Thank you, Teri. And sorry, go ahead.
Can I just add? So, I mean, I guess the obvious point that Teri was just making is that if you want to maximize your value, you better dot your I's and cross your T's and eliminate as much risk as you can from the calculation. I was also going to just tie this back to the inventors for a second. I think it's another reason why having your inventors be along with you on the ride, or at least to have a good open dialogue with them is important. Because as the institution and the tech transfer office start going through, a lot of questions will come up in the tech transfer office as you get ready to do this, like, oh my God, what does our federal reporting look like around this technology? Did we get a biological material from a third party or receive funding from a foundation or something we didn't know about? So having a good open dialogue with your inventors so that the institution can reduce as much risk as possible and maximize the value of its asset is very beneficial to have a good cordial relationship with your inventors.
Definitely. I want to just thank Ryan. He's going in and answering a bunch of the questions that have come in from the audience, because we've had so many questions come in. Some of these we will also send out afterwards, because they are really interesting questions, but in the interest of time, we're not going to have time to answer absolutely everything. Andrew, I do want to go to you, talk about what kind of upfront investment may be needed by an institution to look at a royalty monetization? What type of specialty help is usually recommended, in addition to the expertise that's already in the office with regards to the license agreement?
Sure, Kirsten, happy to do that. I'll try to be quick about this, given where we are on time. So look, these are very complex, specialized transactions. They're not like an equity or debt deal, which are usually regular way transactions that you'll find a banker could do. You really benefit from having specialists that have the experience in royalty monetization to help you along the way. And some of the these specialty resources are going to be asset related, and some of them are going to be process related, and there's going to be a combination. And it's really mostly about, one, getting an appraisal done. That appraisal is going to inform a number of decisions as you move along in the royalty monetization process, not the least of which getting buy-in from your stakeholders and setting up the right structure. It also helps along the way when you're starting to talk about some other matters. Again, when you will pull the trigger at the end of the day, with the bids that you have in hand. From an asset and process perspective, you're going to want deal counsel like Ryan that has the experience with these deals to one, ferret out and fix some of the ambiguities maybe, or some of the terms that might be challenging in a license agreement. Those should be done. They should be pre-wired before you go to market. You're going to want those consents to share information, and if you have to get consent to assign, yes, you're going to obviously want to cover that too, although there are ways around that with the UCC code. But having an experienced deal counsel on board is going to be extremely helpful. In fact, it's going to be instrumental in getting a deal done, because the royalty purchase agreement there's a market for that. There are certain terms that the market expects to receive, and if you're working with deal counsel that doesn't have that experience, they're not going to be able to provide you that perspective. You're also going to want external IP counsel, and the reason why you're going to want it externally is because it's very easy to fall in love with your own IP. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but I think it's very easy to do that. So having somebody else that also has royalty monetization experience, and there are IP counsels that do have that type of experience, take a look at the patent or the patent family and make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed in that regard. And this is going to be obviously self-serving, but having an advisor as a Sherpa is helpful. I think Teri commented somewhat on this. There's a project management that has to be done here, and having a Sherpa on board will be helpful to do all of that. So, the investing, probably the biggest investment is going to be in getting that appraisal done. That could sometimes be a six-figure endeavor, but also when you hire counsel is typically charging hourly. So those are the two elements that are going to be a front-end cost. Advisors are typically working on a success fee, and usually that fee is back-end loaded, and an advisor is not paid until the royalty monetization gets done.
Hey, Andrew, what's your thought on getting an IP opinion that you include in the materials when you go out to market?
Great question, Ryan. What we have found are IP memos get written, but memos, not opinions. I think the formal opinion, at least in my experience, I have found to be challenging to get, just given the exposure that it puts a law firm at, or
Sure.
be subject to. And so, it would be fantastic if we got an IP opinion on every transaction. Just in my experience, I've found it difficult to do, or difficult to get, and somewhat expensive. More often than not, I'm seeing an IP memo, and that gets included in the data room along with some of the other marketing materials.
Right. And that's part of what you're getting from that IP counsel, that independent IP counsel you're talking about.
Correct.
Yeah.
Teri, go ahead.
I just want to make one comment on the valuation. It's not just the net present value of money or something like that. It's a very sophisticated analysis that involves interviews with key opinion leaders, with people in healthcare, with those that are experienced with a specific disease, with those who are looking at other solutions to the therapy that are coming up in the market. And it's really impressive. And it was one of the most interesting things for me to be involved in this process. But I think even more telling is we did this monetization in 2018. And when we look now at the projections that were made based on that process, they are right on the line. I mean, they are right on the line that was predicted, right on the line.
Awesome. All right, we have 2 minutes left and I want to get in 4 questions. So quickly, can you monetize in other asset classes? All we've talked about is therapeutics. Ryan, would you maybe want to try with this one?
Yeah, definitely. The one thing I would say, though, is I think the universe of buyers is smaller. I think pharma is the asset class that has the deepest pool of capital and the most expertise. It does require someone to really have, what Teri was saying about the valuation. The buyer needs to have their own equivalent perspective on that. And so it's a significant investment of expertise that a buyer needs to have to be able to come up with an informed view of what the future cash flows are. But you could absolutely monetize in other fields. I just think you'll find a smaller universe of buyers.
Yeah, well, look, Gatorade, they made billions on that royalty. So I think that there are certainly other areas that one could affect this. I've actually seen them in agriculture. I've seen them in engineering. Obviously, oil and gas has lots of royalties, as does media. I think that probably is somewhat out of the purview of the audience that we're talking to here, but I've certainly seen those types of transactions done, and it does seem that why healthcare benefits so much from this, or is able to do large monetizations in the healthcare space, are the regulatory and IP protections that come with a therapeutic invention.
All right, next question, Todd. So Emory obviously did a couple of monetizations, or you've been involved in a couple of them, but these are pretty rare events. Can you just speak really quickly to why these are such rare events? Why it hasn't been done perhaps since?
Oh, you didn't ask the question I saw in the chat that I was.
Okay, well, you can answer the question you saw in the chat.
But I was hoping I wouldn't be asked that question. Why hasn't Emory done it since? Well, first of all, these type of assets don't come along very often.
Right.
That's the biggest reason. And secondly, I guess I'm trying to think about how to dance around this, and maybe I can even sort of put the question I wanted to put in. I wonder if anybody's looked at. It's probably highly unlikely in one of these transactions that the university is going to make exactly what they would have made had they not monetized. and had the product continued to stay on the sale and generated its full potential. Did I miss it? Is it on there? Oh, no. And so the question is, I wonder how, so you're going to get less money than if the product stays on the market, does well, and you accumulate it. So there's risk associated with that, right? And so I think one of the reasons comes into whether you should do it more often or not, because I don't think universities are doing it all the time, is based upon sort of how your institution wants to address cash flow issues versus the money here and now. And what sort of risk tolerance you have. There are many ways we diversify at an institution, and this can be another.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to just ask my last question. This slide is kind of our Oscars music telling us that that we need to go. But the contact information for our panelists is on the slide if you would like to follow up with any questions to them. Teri, do you want to leave us with any parting thoughts on other resources people could go to if they are considering royalty monetization, or is there something that we could follow up with people afterwards that would be helpful to them?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and the reason we're doing this webinar, is there not a lot of central information about this. You can certainly Google and find law firms involved in this area that have primers and frequently asked questions, and would encourage you to look at those and walk through them. But one of the things that's on my list is perhaps to work with this group and this panel to put together a primer or an FAQ that could be more generally available, because it is an interesting area and it does represent an opportunity for universities as they're considering the best way to manage their assets.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for staying on so much longer. We obviously had a ton of questions come in about this topic. Do feel free to follow up with them about any other questions you have. You all were so excellent today. Really appreciate the time you put into sharing your expertise, and I'm sure people will follow up if they have additional questions for you. Thank you to our audience for joining us as well. As you leave, you will receive, you will see actually on your screen a short survey. We do respond to these surveys. We look at them for future topics as well. So thank you all for joining us today, and everyone have a great rest of your day.